My name is Rudy Halloran. Before the world went to hell, I greased gears for a living. That's the honest version. The official version, the one printed on the badge I kept clipped to my jacket pocket for 19 years, said Bridge Maintenance Mechanic, County Highway Department, District 4. What it meant in practice was that I spent most of my adult life inside a steel tower on the Vermilion River, 90 feet above a town called Halsey Landing, with a grease gun in one hand and a rag in the other, listening to machinery that most people crossed over twice a day and never once thought about. The bridge was a vertical lift. If you don't know the type, picture two steel towers standing in the river on concrete piers, and between them a roadway span that doesn't swing or fold. It goes straight up, like an elevator, hauled by wire ropes that run over sheaves the size of a farm pond's grain bin at the top of each tower, with counterweights hanging inside the towers to balance the whole thing out. 900 tons of steel road deck, and once the counterweights are trimmed right, a 50-horse motor can lift it. That's the trick of it. That's the part I loved. Balance does the work, and the motor just persuades. I knew that bridge the way some men know a boat or a hunting rifle. I knew that the North Tower drive shaft had a lazy coupling that talked at you around 40 degrees Fahrenheit and shut up above 60. I knew the third rung on the northeast caged ladder had been replaced in 1998 with a piece of rebar by somebody who should have been fired for it, and that it rang a different note under a boot than the rungs above and below it. I knew where the open gearing needed lube and where it just needed to be left alone. I knew the smell of the machinery house in August, hot iron and open gear compound and pigeon, and the smell of it in February, which is nothing at all, because February takes your nose away before you're up the first flight. I won't pretend that was a glamorous life. It was a good one, though. Union scale, a pension that everybody said was going to disappear. 3 weeks off, and a job where nobody looked over my shoulder because nobody else understood what they were looking at. Twice a year, an inspection team would come out with clipboards and ultrasonic gauges, and they'd ask me questions, and I'd answer them, and they'd write down what I said and put their own name at the bottom. That's how it works. The men who know the machine are never the ones who sign for it. My wife Deb died 26 months before all this. Aneurysm at the kitchen sink on a Tuesday while the radio was on. There's no lesson in it. I've looked. There isn't one. That left me with June, who was 11, and Sam, who was 7. June was the kind of kid who reads instructions. Sam was the kind who takes things apart to see if he can get them back together. And he can't. And he doesn't care. I got them to school. I got myself to the bridge. And on the days a barge came upriver, I raised the span and stopped the traffic. And the whole town got to be annoyed with me for 4 minutes. And I liked that too, honestly. 4 minutes where a piece of the world moved because I moved it. And I had my brother Neil. Neil was 6 years older, and he drove a refrigerated route for a company that hauled biological specimens between hospitals and diagnostic labs across 4 states. Coolers, dry ice, chain of custody paperwork. A van with a temperature log that beeped at him if the box got above a certain number. He'd been doing it 11 years. He was the kind of man who read the whole manual and then read the appendix. He called me every Sunday whether either of us had anything to say, and mostly we didn't. And we talked anyway. That's the man I was. That's the ground I was standing on. Now, let me tell you about the bridge itself, because everything that comes after this is about that bridge, and if you don't understand it, none of the rest will land. There are 2 towers. Each one is a lattice of riveted steel, and inside each one, on the riverside, hangs a counterweight. A concrete block strung on 8 wire ropes that run up over the sheaves at the top, and back down to the corners of the lift span. When the span goes up, The counterweights come down inside the towers, and they pass each other in the middle like two elevators trading places. There is a caged ladder up the outside of each tower, and a second ladder inside the tower for the counterweight guides, which you're not supposed to use and which I used constantly. At the top of each tower is a machinery house. Little steel-clad rooms, maybe 18 feet by 22, floored with checker plate, holding the sheave bearings, and in the north tower, the span drive motor, the reducer, the brakes, the limit switches, and the auxiliary drive for when the primary quit, which it did every couple of winters. There's a catwalk that runs from the top of the ladder to the machinery house door. The door is steel, with a lever handle and a hasp, because in 2011, somebody's kid got up there on a dare, and the county's response was a padlock. And on the lift span itself, dead center, is the operator's house. That's where I spent the slow hours. It's about the size of a two-car garage, glassed on 3 sides so you can see up and down river, with a control desk, a chair with the stuffing coming out, a bathroom the size of a phone booth, a hot plate, a space heater, and a bulletin board where every operator since 1962 had thumbtacked something stupid. The operator's house rides up with a span. That's the whole point I want you to understand. When that span goes to full height, the operator's house goes with it, 90 feet up, and there is not one single way to get to it that doesn't involve a tower ladder and a catwalk and a hatch. One way in, one choke point. I didn't know that was going to matter. I want to be clear about that. I never once stood in that machinery house and thought about holding it against anybody. I thought about grease intervals and brake wear and whether the county was going to buy me a new torque wrench. Nobody looks up. Not at a bridge, not at anything. Nobody ever does until something falls on them. Now, the thing you have to understand about the beginning is that there wasn't one. Not a real one. Not the kind with a date. There was a week in late October where the local news ran a story about a cluster of respiratory cases at a regional hospital 200 miles east. And the anchor said the word contained, and the weather came on after. There was a Thursday where the school sent home a note about attendance. There was a Sunday where the parking lot at the landing mart had more cars than usual, and half the shelf of bottled water was gone. And I remember thinking, storm coming, and there was no storm. I've gone back over it 100 times, looking for the moment I should have known. And it isn't there. What's there is a slow tilt. The barge traffic thinned out. That was the one that touched my life directly, because barge traffic was my job. We'd get 4, 5 lifts a week in fall, hauling ag product downriver. Second week of November, I did 1 lift the whole week. I called the dispatcher at the terminal to ask if the season was closing early. And a woman I'd talked to for 6 years said they were short crews. And there was something in the way she said short that I noticed and did not act on. Then the dogs. There's a stray population in any river town, and Halsey Landings lived under the east approach ramp. And I'd been feeding a brindle mutt out of my lunch bag for 3 years without ever giving him a name. Third week of November, they were gone. All of them. Not dead in the road, which is how strays usually go. Just gone, the way birds go before weather. Sirens picked up around then. Not constantly, just more than a town of 6,000 should generate. Ambulance out to the county line and back, twice in a night, 3 times. I'd hear them from the operator's house with the window cracked. And I'd track them the way you track thunder, counting, guessing distance. And then I'd go back to my crossword. The last normal day of my life was a Tuesday, the 2nd of December. And it was 38 degrees and gray, and I was topping off the reducer in the North Machinery House because the sight glass had been low for a month. Neil showed up at 2 in the afternoon. Not at the house, at the bridge. He drove his personal truck onto the west approach and parked it in the maintenance pull-off where nobody's allowed to park. And he stood at the bottom of the northeast ladder with his hands in his coat pockets and waited for me to come down. That alone should have told me. Neil had been to that bridge maybe 4 times in 19 years, and every one of those times he called first. I came down, 80-some rungs, and my hands were cold on the rail. And I remember being irritated because I had the reducer open. He looked like he hadn't slept. That's not a figure of speech. His eyes were pink at the rims, and he had a shaving cut, and he was standing wrong, with his weight forward, the way a man stands when he's already decided to leave. He said, "Rudy, go get June and Sam out of school right now. Pack what you can put in the truck in one trip, and be somewhere you can hold by dark." I laughed at him. I want that on the record. My brother came to me with the only warning any of us got, and I laughed. And I said something about him watching too much of that channel he watched. He didn't argue. That's the part that turned my stomach cold. And it's the part I keep out of all of it. Neil argued about everything. He argued about tire pressure. He argued about the correct way to load a dishwasher. He stood there and let me laugh. And then he said, 4 hours, maybe 6. Not longer. I asked him what it was. He said, "I can't tell you." I asked him again, and I got louder. And he looked at the river the whole time, and then he said the only other thing he'd give me. He said, "I've been running a route for 11 years, and this week they changed the packaging on everything. And the paperwork stopped being paperwork. And yesterday I delivered to a building with soldiers on it that had a state seal on the door on Friday." And then he said, "If I tell you what I saw, you'll spend 2 hours arguing about whether it's real. You don't have 2 hours. Go get your kids." I said, "Come with us." He said no. He had a wife, Dorothy, and a route. And he said he had 3 more stops and people who'd be waiting on him. And I told him that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. And he agreed with me, and he got in his truck anyway. That's a thing I've had to learn to hold. Not everybody who saves you is going to let you save them back. He put his hand flat on the window glass when he pulled out. Not a wave, just his hand on the glass. I stood there in the pull-off for about 90 seconds. Then I climbed back up and closed the reducer, because that's who I am. And then I got in my truck, and I drove to the elementary school, and I signed out my son, and then to the middle school, and I signed out my daughter. And both offices signed them over without a question. I made up a story about a family emergency in Dubuque. Nobody cared. There were 4 other parents doing the same thing in the middle school office, and I noticed that, and I said nothing to any of them. Here's the thing I've never gotten around. I had 4 hours, and it was mine. I could have called Ruthie Dressler 2 doors down, who'd taught both my kids in 3rd grade and who had a husband on oxygen. I could have called Marv at the county garage. I could have stood up in the middle school office and said what my brother told me. I had the only advance notice in Halsey Landing, Illinois, and I spent it loading my own truck. I'm going to come back to that. It's the whole spine of this. But at the time, I didn't even experience it as a choice. It came through me as a shape, not a thought. And the shape was, if I tell people, the roads fill, the store's empty, and the 4 hours become 20 minutes. I understood in my gut, before my head caught up, that a warning is only worth something, while it's still mostly mine. And I acted on that understanding. And my children are alive. We were home by 3:15. I want to tell you I ran a clean, calm loading operation. I didn't. I stood in my own kitchen for a full minute with my hands on the counter, breathing, because my hands were doing that thing where they don't feel like they're attached at the wrist. Sam kept asking if we were going to Aunt Dorothy's. June had already gone to her room and was packing. And when I checked on her, she'd laid out her school backpack and my dead wife's canvas duffel, and she was putting in socks, underwear, a coat, a book, and the framed picture off her dresser. And she looked up at me and said, "Dad, how many days?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Then I'm packing for cold." 11 years old, at 4:11 in the afternoon. While I was carrying the second load out to the truck, I heard the first horn. Not a car horn, the plant horn at the grain terminal a mile south, which sounded at 7, at noon, and at 4 every day of my life. And it went at 4:11, and it did not stop. Somebody was leaning on it. I put the crate in the truck bed, and I stood in my driveway, and I listened. And then I heard the cars. Not traffic. Traffic has a rhythm. This was engines with no rhythm. And then a sound like a sheet of plywood dropped flat, which was a wreck at the Ostrander and 5th intersection, which I could not see from my driveway, but could hear perfectly. Then people started coming up Ostrander from the south, on foot. And that's how I knew, because they were running wrong. That's the only way I can put it. I've seen people run from a fire, and I've seen people run from a fight. Those people run in a direction. These people were running the way water runs, which is to say downhill and around obstacles, and half of them were looking behind them instead of ahead of them and taking each other down in the road. And then, at the bottom of the street, at the corner where the Cormanies had that stone planter, one of them fell, and the man behind him fell on top of him, and did not get up, and did not get up, and did not get up. And when he did get up, his face and his throat were dark and wet, and he was chewing. I've watched that man from that distance about 4,000 times since. 200 yards, gray light, wet street. I never learned his name. My son was standing on our front step at that moment because I hadn't told him to stay inside, and I don't know if he saw it, and I have never asked him. Here's the ugly, unheroic truth of the next 10 minutes. I did not think about helping anybody. I thought about arithmetic. I thought, the roads are already closing, the school is that way, the hospital is that way, and everything in this town that draws a crowd is on the ground and flat and full of doors. And I thought about the only thing in a 15-mile radius that goes up. It didn't feel like a movie. That's what I need you to hear. In a movie, there's a moment where the man's jaw sets. There was no jaw. I was a 44-year-old widower with a bad knee and shaking hands, standing in a driveway with a laundry basket of canned goods, doing math about ladder rungs. What I felt was mostly a kind of embarrassed clarity, like being the only one at the meeting who's read the report. Crowds are the killer. That's the arithmetic. Whatever this was, it moved person to person, hand to mouth, and it moved faster where people were packed. Every shelter, every church basement, every gymnasium the county would open in the next 12 hours was a room with 100 people and 4 doors. And it was going to be a slaughterhouse with a sign-in sheet. Altitude and isolation is the whole answer. Not because height is magic, because height is a filter. A thing that can't climb can't reach you. And a thing that can climb has to do it one at a time, slowly, in a place you chose. So I went to the bridge. Not because I'm brave, because it was the only building in my life whose bolts I knew by heart. I got the kids in the truck at 4:31. I know the time because June wrote it down later in a notebook she started keeping. And she is her mother's daughter. And there is nothing that happens to us now that isn't written down somewhere in her handwriting. Before I turned out of the driveway, I did one thing, and it's the last decent thing I did for about a week. I drove 1 block east and stopped at Ruthie Dressler's and pounded on her door. And when she opened it, I said, Get in your basement, lock it. Don't open it for anybody. Do it now. She said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I don't know." And I drove away. 1 block, 12 seconds. That's what I paid out of 4 hours. Then I sat at the stop sign at Ostrander and 3rd with my son crying in the back seat, and I made the list. I want to talk about the list because people get this part wrong. I did not drive around town gathering everything I could find. That's how you die. What I did was take a receipt out of the cup holder and a carpenter's pencil out of my coat and write down, in order, 6 words. And then I wrote what each word needed underneath it. Heat, water, food, power, access, waste. That was it. That's still it. That list is thumbtacked to the bulletin board in the operator's house right now, in carpenter pencil on the back of a receipt from the landing mart for a gallon of milk and a bag of dog food for a dog that wasn't mine. The order matters. Heat first, because it was December in Illinois, and cold kills faster and quieter than anything with teeth. Water second, because you can go a month without food and 3 days without water. And I had a river under my feet and no way to make it safe yet. Food third, because we could stretch. Power fourth, because power is a want dressed up as a need, except for the one place it isn't. Access fifth, because a stronghold you can't close is a building. Waste sixth and last. And I underlined it, because I'd read enough about sieges to know that more people die of their own latrine than of the enemy. Then I made 3 stops. 3, not 30. Stop 1 was the county highway garage on Route 9, 4 minutes north, because I had a key and because everything I actually needed was in a building that belonged to me more than it belonged to the county. Nobody was there. Marv's truck wasn't in the lot, and the bay door was up, which Marv would never leave. And I did not go look for Marv. I took the salamander heater and every propane bottle on the rack, which was 9. I took 200 feet of half-inch poly rope and 100 of 3/8 wire rope with a come-along. I took the chainfall. I took both grease guns and 4 tubes of open gear compound, because a bridge that seizes is a bridge that stops being a door. I took the acetylene rig, and then I put the acetylene rig back, because I had 2 kids in the truck, and I've seen what a dropped bottle does. I took the plasma cutter instead, which needed power, which I would deal with. I took 12 moving blankets, the first aid cabinet, 4 rolls of 6mm poly sheeting, a case of duct tape, the cordless drill and both batteries, screws, 2 crowbars, a hacksaw and a dozen blades, and the shop's chimney kit, which had been sitting in a corner since 2014. When somebody had the idea to put a wood stove in the break room, and OSHA said no. That chimney kit is the reason my children have 10 fingers between them. I also took the shop stove, which had been sitting next to the chimney kit for the same 11 years. Little Vermont-style cast-iron box, 240 pounds. And I got it into the truck bed by myself with a ramp and a come-along, and I tore something in my shoulder doing it. And I did not find out how bad for 3 weeks. Stop 2 was the landing mart, and it was already bad. There were maybe 40 people in that parking lot, and about 9 of them were fighting over a shopping cart, and I did not go inside. I went around back to the loading dock, where I'd bought a scratch and dent pallet of dented cans off the manager twice a year for the fire department's food drive. And the dock door was up because the receiving guy had run and left it that way. And I took a hand truck, and I took what I could reach in 4 minutes. 2 cases of canned chili, a case of green beans, peanut butter, an entire case of it. 4 10-pound bags of rice and 2 of pinto beans off a pallet nobody had touched because it was dry goods, and everybody was grabbing bottled water. Salt, a carton of matches, 2 flats of canned peaches, which turned out to be the single best thing I stole, because in February, a can of peaches is worth more than a gun. I heard somebody scream inside the store while I was loading, and I kept loading. I'm not going to dress that up. Stop 3 was Tolliver Marine, which was a two-bay shop by the boat ramp where Denny Tolliver sold outboards and repaired them badly. Denny was gone. His door was already broken by somebody else. I took a Honda 2000 generator and both 5-gallon fuel jugs behind it, and a Marine deep cycle battery, and a second one, and a 12-volt charge controller, and 200 watts of flexible solar panel that Denny had been trying to move for 3 years because nobody in Halsey Landing wanted solar. I took a handheld VHF radio and its charging cradle and the fixed mount VHF off the display wall with its whip antenna. I took 2 spools of 12-gauge wire, a battery box, and a pack of inline fuses. And I want you to know that the fuses are the reason we had light in January, and not the panels. It's always the small part. And on the way out, I took Denny's landing net, and a 5-gallon bucket, and a coil of 1/4-inch nylon, because a bucket on a rope is how you get water out of a river when you live 90 feet above it. 4:58 in the afternoon. Full dark coming. 27 minutes of scavenging total. I drove down Water Street to the bridge with my headlights off because the street lights were still on, and I did not want to be a moving thing that shone. There was a man on the west approach. He was standing on the center line of the roadway between me and my bridge, about 60 feet out. And he was facing away from me, and he wasn't doing anything. That's what I remember. He was just standing on a road in the dark, weight on both feet, head down a little, like a machine waiting for an input. I stopped. June said, "Dad," I said, "put your head down and hold your brother's hand." I did not think about being merciful, and I did not think about being cruel. I put the truck in first, and I came up on him at maybe 12 miles an hour. And I laid on the horn 1 full second before I got there, because if he turned around, and he was a scared man, I was going to stop. And if he turned around, and he was the other thing, I was going to keep going. He turned around. I kept going. I'm not going to describe it. I'll say the truck's right front took him, and the sound that came up through the floor pan was not like hitting a deer. And I felt it in the wheel and in my boots. And I have felt it in my boots every night since. And I drove up onto the west approach and out over the water, and I did not look in the mirror. The bridge was dark, and the gate arms were up, and the span was down, which is how it sits when nobody's asked it to be anything else. I did something then that I'd thought about for maybe 10 seconds total, and that turned out to be the best decision of my life. I drove the truck out onto the lift span itself, past the operator's house, and parked it dead center between the trunnion girders, and set the brake, and chocked all 4 wheels with the timbers we kept for the striping crew. Because a lift span is an elevator. Whatever's on it goes up with it. Then I got out and I went to work. And the work is what saved me. Because work is a place to put your hands when your head is no good. First, I cleared. I'm going to walk you through it because it's the same thing you'd do in any building, just vertical. The operator's house on the span first, because my kids were sitting in a truck 20 feet from its door. Flashlight in my left hand, crowbar in my right, and I went in low and swept it. Nothing. Lyle Pettitbon had the day shift, and Lyle had gone home at 2. And his coffee cup was on the desk, and his jacket wasn't on the hook. And I stood there for a second, feeling something about that. And then I moved on. Bathroom. Empty. Cabinet under the desk. Empty. The house has a hatch in the floor for the cable trough. And I opened it and put the light down there, and it was cable trough. Then the towers. Both of them. And this is where I earned my 19 years. Because the towers have places to hide that aren't on any drawing. The caged ladder up the northeast leg 84 rungs, and I counted them out loud on the way up because my hands were still shaking. And counting gives your mouth something to do. The catwalk, the machinery house door, padlocked, my key. Inside, the smell of iron and grease, and the sheave bearings the size of tractor tires overhead, and the span drive with the manufacturer's plate from 1962 that I had polished with my sleeve maybe 400 times. Empty. Pigeons in the northwest corner where the flashing had lifted, and I nearly came out of my boots when they went. And I want you to know I said a word out loud that my daughter has never heard from me. Then the counterweight pit at the base, and the south tower, all of it, 22 minutes total. Nothing. Nobody. The bridge was mine. Then power, because I needed it for 4 minutes, and then I didn't care if I never had it again. The span drive ran off a submarine cable that came out from the substation on the west bank and up through the pier. That cable was still hot. I'll never know why. Something about the grid staying up in that district for another 2 days while the town it fed came apart. Somewhere there was a substation doing its job with nobody in the building. And I have thought about that more than is healthy. I threw the disconnect, I released the span locks, and I lifted my bridge. You've never heard a sound like it if you haven't stood on one. The brakes let go with a clack you feel in your sternum. The motor takes up and the reducer starts to sing. And then the wire ropes come tight over the sheaves, 8 per corner, and 900 tons decides to be an elevator. The counterweights come down inside the towers past you, huge and slow and absolutely silent. And the whole world outside the glass starts to sink. 60 feet, 70, 80. I watched the amps on the panel because a truck's worth of extra weight is nothing on a span that size, but I watched anyway. And the needle sat where it always sat. And I remember being obscurely proud of that. 91 feet at full open, decked to normal pool. I set the brakes, and I dropped the limit, and I killed the disconnect, and I stood in the operator's house with my 2 kids, and looked down at the town I'd lived in for 44 years. There were 4 fires, 2 on the south end, 1 at the terminal, 1 that I think was the tire shop on Route 9. There were headlights all over the grid of streets, moving in ways headlights don't move. And the sound came up the way sound does over water, clean and undegraded. So I could hear car alarms and a dog and a woman's voice somewhere calling a name over and over. 3 syllables, a name I couldn't make out. And she called it for a long time. And then she stopped. June said, "Are we going to go get Uncle Neil?" I said, "Uncle Neil's the reason we're up here." That's the last I said about it for 2 months. The first night was the worst night, and it wasn't close, and it had nothing to do with the dead. It was 31 degrees. The operator's house is glass on 3 sides, and its only heat was a $200 space heater that needed the shore power I'd just killed. I ran the salamander for 20 minutes on propane to take the edge off, and then shut it down because a salamander in a closed glass box is a carbon monoxide dispenser with a handle. And I opened a window while it ran, which defeated the whole purpose. And that told me everything I needed to know about tomorrow's first job. We slept on the floor of the operator's house in moving blankets with the truck seat cushions under us. Sam wet himself at some point in the night and was so ashamed he wouldn't come out from under the blanket. And I told him a story about a man I worked with who did the same thing at 48 years old the time a scaffold plank let go under him, which is true, and which I have never told anyone else. And I told my 7-year-old, and he came out. I didn't sleep. I sat in Lyle's chair with a crowbar across my knees and watched a town I knew every street of turn into a thing with fires in it. Around 3 in the morning, the streetlights went off. The whole grid at once. and after that it was just the fires. And I'll tell you the thought I had at 3 in the morning, sitting up there. Because if I only tell you the competent parts of this story, I'm lying to you. I thought, Ruthie Dressler is in her basement because I told her to be. And Marv is not, because I didn't call him. And the woman calling that name is not, because I didn't roll my window down. And there are 2,000 people down there who did not have 4 hours. And I had 4 hours, and I spent them on canned peaches. I sat with that until it got light. Then I got up and started on heat because my daughter was shivering in her sleep. And because a man who can't stop the guilt can at least go put a stove in. Cold was the next enemy on the list. The operator's house was the wrong building for it, and I knew that before I touched a tool. Glass on 3 sides, single pane, aluminum frame, floor of steel plate over open air. In a hard wind, it would bleed heat faster than any stove I could feed. The right building was the North Machinery House, at the top of the tower. Steel-clad, no windows but one small one. Insulated already because the county had blown it out in the 80s to keep the reducer oil from thickening, and floored in checker plate over a solid deck. But the machinery house was at the top of a tower, and my kids were on the span, and the only way between them was a catwalk and a ladder. That's the trade I sat with all morning. And it's the first real decision I made as something other than a scared man. And I decided, the span is the house, and the tower is the fort. We live where we can live together, and we hold where we can hold. If it ever came to it, the kids go up the ladder into the North Machinery House, and I close the hatch behind them. And whatever's coming has to come up 84 rungs, one at a time, past me. So the operator's house had to be made survivable, which meant killing the glass. Here's what I did, and any tradesman listening is going to nod, and any architect is going to wince. I took the moving blankets, and I hung them against the glass, but not touching it. That's the trick nobody knows. A blanket flat against cold glass just gets cold, and then radiates cold at you. You want an air gap. I ran screws into the aluminum frame every 18 inches, strung tie wire between them 2 inches off the pane, and hung the blankets on the wire like a curtain. Then over the blankets, on the inside, I stapled 6mm poly, sealed at the edges with duct tape, so you had glass, then dead air, then wool, then dead air, then plastic. 4 layers, 2 of them air. And air is the whole game in insulation. Everything else is just a way to hold air still. The north and west faces I did first because that's where the weather comes from in that valley. The east face I left one panel clear, chest height, and I taped a frame of cardboard around it so it looked like nothing from below. That was our window on the world for 4 months. About 14 by 20 inches of single-pane glass looking downriver. And we fought over it like it was a television. Then the floor. Steel deck over 90 feet of open air pulls heat out of a body like a wick. I took the timber chocks and the striping crew's dunnage, and I laid a sleeper floor, 2x4s on flat. And I filled between them with everything soft I had that we weren't wearing. And then I laid the truck's floor mats and a piece of plywood off the county truck's bed over the top. It was ugly. It was maybe 1.5 inches of nothing. It changed that room by a full 10 degrees at ankle height. And ankle height is where children live. Then heat, and heat was the harder problem. Because heat is the one that kills you if you get it wrong. I had a 240-pound cast iron box stove sitting in a truck bed on a bridge span, and I had to get it into a glass building without setting the glass building on fire, and I had to vent it. Getting it in was rigging, which is my trade, so that part was almost a pleasure. Ramp of 2 planks, come along anchored to the door frame's post, cribbing under it as it moved, so that if the come along let go, It dropped 4 inches instead of 4 feet. No solo hero moves is a rule I made later and mostly kept. And I broke it that day. And my shoulder still tells me about it when the weather turns. The hearth had to come first. You do not set a wood stove on a steel deck and call it fireproof, because steel conducts, and what it conducts into is whatever is underneath, which in my case was a cable trough with insulated wire in it. So I built a pad. 2 courses of concrete pavers I pried out of the West Approach's decorative edging on a scavenge run. Laid on a sheet of cement board I took out of the county garage's bathroom remodel pile with an airspace under it made of steel angle. Airspace again. Always airspace. Then the chimney. And this is the part I want you to actually remember if you remember nothing else. Single wall pipe from the stove collar, straight up 2 feet, then a 45. Then out through the wall, then a T with a cleanout at the bottom. Then vertical double wall Class A pipe up past the roof line. Where it went through the wall, I used the kit's insulated thimble, which is a double-sleeved collar that keeps the hot pipe from ever touching wood or steel, with 2 inches of air all around it. The kit came with it. Somebody in 2014 spent county money on a part that saved my life 11 years later. And I hope they got a good pension. I ran the pipe up 8 feet above the roof, higher than you'd think you need because draft is about height, and because I didn't want a wind eddy off the sheave housing pushing smoke back down on us. I guyed it with 3 lengths of tie wire. The first fire I built in that stove I built with the door cracked and a bucket of river water beside me and both kids standing outside on the span in coats. And I watched that thimble with my hand on the wall next to it for 40 minutes, feeling for heat that never came. And when I finally believed it, I sat down on the floor and my legs went, and I laughed at nothing for a while. June thought I'd lost it. Maybe I had a little. Fuel for the stove was the next problem. And here's where the bridge gave me something no farmhouse ever would. There were timbers. The county had stockpiled replacement decking planks under the east approach for a rehab job that never got funded. Oak, 6 by 12, 40 of them, aged 9 years. I could reach them on a night run with the truck. And I did. 3 trips over 2 weeks, and cut them into stove lengths with a bow saw. Oak that's been sitting dry under a bridge for 9 years burns like it's been waiting to. Water came next, and the river made it easy and hard at the same time. Easy, because I had a 5-gallon bucket, a coil of 1/4-inch nylon, and 91 feet of drop straight down into moving water. Hard, because a bucket on a rope full of water weighs 45 pounds, and pulling 45 pounds up 90 feet by hand, 4 times a day, will ruin a man in a week. So I made a windlass, piece of 2-inch black pipe through 2 pillow blocks off a scrapped conveyor, a crank off a boat trailer winch, and a snatch block hung off the downstream fair lead. 2 minutes a bucket instead of 8, and a kid could do it, and eventually a kid did. But river water in a collapsing county is not water. It's a suggestion of water. Upstream of us was a town, and the sewage lift stations quit when the grid did. And I knew exactly what that meant because I'd sat in county meetings about it. So everything got treated. And here was the order. Settle, filter, boil. Settle first, because that's free. 2 food-grade barrels I took out of the car wash, drawn full and left overnight. And in the morning, the top 80% siphons off clean, and the bottom 4 inches of silt goes over the side. People skip this because it isn't dramatic, and it does more work than anything else in the chain. Filter second. Through a bucket filter I built out of a 5-gallon pail. A bulkhead fitting, gravel, sand, and charcoal I made in the stove. And eventually through 2 actual ceramic elements that came up the ladder in a stranger's backpack, which is a story I'll get to. Boil third, hard rolling, 1 full minute at our elevation, And I timed it every single time with a wind-up kitchen timer, because I do not trust my own count when I'm tired. Light and power was fourth on the list, and I want to be honest that it was mostly a want. You do not need power. You need to not be seen. That's the whole design principle, and it drove every choice. The generator I'd stolen from Denny Tolliver ran maybe 9 hours total in 5 months, all of it in the daylight. All of it with the exhaust piped into a length of flex hose, stuffed into a barrel packed with rags. And every time I ran it, I hated it. Because sound over water travels for miles, and a Honda generator sounds like exactly one thing. What we actually ran on was 200 watts of flexible solar laid flat on the machinery house roof, where nothing below could see the glare, wired down to a charge controller and 2 deep-cycle marine batteries in a vented box. 12 volts. Not enough for anything with a heating element, plenty for what mattered. 3 LED strips, the VHF radio, and the drill batteries. The lights were the fussy part. Light at night in a glass room, 90 feet up, is a lighthouse announcing that somebody up here has resources. So we ran red. Red LED strip, cut short, dimmed with a resistor, mounted low and pointed down at the floor, with a curtain of blanket across the one clear pane after dark. Red because it doesn't kill your night vision and because it doesn't carry. From the west approach on a black night, our house looked like a dead building. I know because I walked down there and checked twice, standing in the road in the cold, looking up at my own children's room and seeing nothing. Waste was 6th on my list, and it should have been higher, and I've told a lot of people that since. Bucket system. 2 5-gallon pails with snap lids, sawdust from the bow saw and later from split oak. 1 for solids and 1 for liquids, because the 2 together is what makes the smell and the flies. Liquids over the side, downstream side of the span, and only from the downstream rail. And I made a rule about it that sounded ridiculous, and was not. Nothing goes in the river north of the bridge. Ever. Because our bucket went down on the upstream side, and the Vermilion is not a fast river in December, and I was not going to have my kids drink what we'd made. Solids went into a barrel with a lid and lime I got out of the highway garage's ice control shed. And every couple weeks I took the barrel down and buried it on the east bank in a pit I dug, 40 yards from the water, downhill of nothing that mattered. That's 4 hours of miserable work in the cold, on the ground, exposed every time. I did it anyway. More people die of their own latrine than of the enemy. And then 6th on the paper, but first in my head every hour of every day. Access. This is the one people want to hear about, and it's the one that's the least exciting, because good access control is boring by design. If your defense is exciting, it has already failed. Here's what we had. The span was up 91 feet, so the roadway was gone. There was no continuous path from ground to us. To reach my kids, a person had to go up one of 4 caged ladders on the outside of the 2 towers, come along a catwalk, get through a machinery house, and then cross from the machinery house down to the span on the one thing I had left in place. So I took the ladders away. Not all of them. 3 of them. The southeast, southwest, and northwest caged ladders each have a bottom section that bolts to a bracket at about the 12-foot mark. And I went down there with a socket set and the plasma cutter running off the generator, and I removed the bottom 18 feet of all 3. And I dropped those sections in the river. That is county property, and I destroyed it, and I'd do it again. What's left on those 3 legs is a caged ladder that starts at 18 feet with nothing under it but smooth, painted steel. The northeast ladder I kept because we needed a way in and out, but I cut its bottom section free too, and rehung it on a pair of trolleys off a piece of channel so it slides up. a rope over a snatch block, a cleat on the catwalk. And one person can lift 18 feet of steel ladder up flat against the tower, where nobody on the ground can reach the lowest rung. Up in the day when we're out, down when we come home, up at dark, always. One way in, then the choke point. Because a determined man with an extension ladder can beat 18 feet. And I knew that from the day I built it. The choke was the north machinery house door and the crossing beyond it. I rehung that steel door to swing outward, so it can't be kicked in. And I fitted it with a bar across the inside, seated in 2 pieces of angle iron. And I welded, or rather I bolted, because I never did get a welder up there, 4 pieces of grating over the one window. Beyond the door, to get from the catwalk down to the span, you crossed a gangway I built out of 2 aluminum ramps off the county's equipment trailer, 22 feet, hinged at the machinery house end, hanging on 2 wire rope legs from a snatch block. We could pull that gangway up in 11 seconds. I timed it. We drilled it. My son could do it at 7 years old, and he thought it was a game, and I let him think that. With the gangway up, the operator's house and the lift span were an island in the air. Not a fortress, an island. There is a difference, and the difference is that an island doesn't need walls. High ground, one way in, a single choke point. Say it until it's boring. It was boring, and it worked. And boring is what working looks like. By the middle of December, days settled into a shape. Water in the morning, wood after, school at the desk with June teaching Sam his letters out of a county safety manual. Watch at the clear pane, stove banked at dark. And the radio. The radio is where the second half of this story lives. That Marine VHF gave me 16 channels and a whip antenna 90 feet in the air over flat river country. And what came out of it those first weeks was not silence. It was people. Channel 16, then a ham band on a scanner I found later. And there were voices out there every night. A man south of us reading county road conditions to nobody. A woman who called herself Cardinal Base, who ran a check-in list of 30-some households and read the names out like a teacher taking attendance. 2 brothers arguing about a water heater. A church group at a campground 12 miles east that broadcast a prayer at 9 every night, and then said, "If you're listening, we have room." I listened to all of it, and I did not key the microphone once for 5 weeks. Because I still had a margin, and the margin was the only thing I owned. Every mile of quiet water between us and everybody else was a wall I hadn't had to build. If I keyed up and said, "This is a lift bridge at Halsey Landing. We have water, we have heat, we have a stove and a roof and a door we can close," then in 3 days I'd have 40 people at the bottom of my tower, and half of them good. And I would have to choose out loud, in front of my children, which half. So I kept the 4 hours. That's what it was. Neil gave me 4 hours, and I never stopped spending them. I heard her before I saw her because she banged on the steel with a wrench. 3 hits, pause, 3 hits, which is a thing bridge people do and nobody else does. There were 2 of them. A woman in her 50s in a high-visibility jacket gone gray with dirt, and a kid, maybe 17, hollow-faced, with a backpack that hung wrong on him. I did the vetting from the catwalk with the ladder up, and a rifle I hadn't fired since 2009 in my hands. And I want to describe how that actually goes, because it is not a conversation. It's an interrogation. And you have to be willing to be a hard, unpleasant man in front of a person who is cold. I asked her name. Marguerite Deal. Margot. I asked, "Where's the last place you stood on dry land where you slept 2 nights running?" She said the maintenance shed at the Route 9 Salt Dome 11 days. I asked, "Either of you been bitten?" Both said no. I asked, "Any deep scratches? Any wound you can't account for?" She pulled her sleeve back and turned her forearm in the light without being asked twice. And that told me more than the answer did. I asked, "Has either of you had blood on you that wasn't your own?" The kid said yes. He said it fast, and he didn't dress it up. And I respected him from that second. I asked, "Any fever? Any chills? Any headache you'd call unexplained? In either of you in the last 4 days?" And Margot Deal looked up at me and said, "If I thought I was turning, I'd be nowhere near another living person. I'd have walked into the river yesterday." I believed her. Not because of the words, because she said it flat, like a fact she'd already sat with alone. Then I told her the rules, before she came up, so that coming up was consent. Nobody moves between the tower and the span without me. Nobody touches the stove, the gangway, or the batteries for 2 weeks. Nothing over the north rail into the river, ever. You sleep in the machinery house, not the operator's house, for 10 days. And the door bar is on my side of it. And that's not personal, that's arithmetic. If you can't take that, I'll lower a bucket with food in it, and you can walk on with my blessing. She said, "What's your name?" I said, "Rudy Halloran. I was the mechanic here." She said, "I know. I inspected this bridge in 2019 and 2021, and I wrote you up for a cracked gusset on the south portal strut that you'd already sistered, and you were rude to me about it." I lowered the ladder. Margot Deal was a fracture-critical bridge inspector for the state, which is to say, of every living person within 100 miles, she was the single most useful human being who could possibly have walked up to my tower. She could read steel. She could rig. Inside a week, she had found 2 things I'd have died of eventually. A loose pin on the gangway hinge I'd set with the wrong hardware, and a hairline in a weld on the stove's chimney support that would have dropped hot pipe into a room with my son in it inside a month. The kid's name was Teodoro. Everybody called him Teo. He'd been a dishwasher. He was the best of us at the windlass, and he sang while he did it, badly. And I let him because sound over water is a risk, and a boy who stopped singing is a bigger one. She brought 2 ceramic filter elements in that backpack. I brought her up for what she knew, and she paid for the whole first month with a plastic bag from a camping store. Now here's the part I've been walking toward. On the 11th of January, Cardinal Base stopped reading her list. I'd listened to that woman for 5 weeks. 31 names, every night, 9 o'clock. And on the 9th, she read 28. On the 10th, she read 22. And her voice was wrong. On the 11th, she didn't come up at all. And the church group at the campground didn't either. And the 2 brothers didn't. And the band was empty except for a carrier hiss. And one man somewhere saying, "Hello, hello, is anybody? Hello." I sat in that chair, and I understood something that I should have understood in a driveway on the 2nd of December. I had built the entire architecture of my survival on a head start, and I had been treating that head start like a bank account. And the thing about a head start is that it isn't an account. It's ice. It doesn't sit there. It goes whether you spend it or not, and mine had been going the whole time, and I had bought nothing with it except distance from people who were now dying inside my radio. So I keyed the microphone. I want to be precise about what I did, because this is the choice I actually made, as opposed to the one that came through me as a shape in a driveway. I broadcast for 9 nights. Same time, 9 o'clock, channel 16, and then up the ham band. And I said everything. I said who I was, and what my brother told me, and the exact hour he told it. I said what I'd seen on Ostrander Street in detail. so people would recognize it before it was on their block. I said the 6 words: heat, water, food, power, access, waste. And then I said the whole procedure out loud, over and over. Get off the ground, take the ladder away, settle your water before you filter it, put your latrine downstream, run your lights red, don't answer a voice you can't see. I told them how to lift a stove with a come-along. I told them about the air gap behind the blanket. I told them about the thimble. And I gave away my margin doing it, and I knew I was doing it. And Margot told me to my face that I was signing our death warrant for a room full of strangers who might not exist. 9 nights. Nobody came back, not one voice, not one time. I got the carrier hiss, and I got the man saying hello, hello. And one night, I got a woman's voice, very far off, that said something with the word children in it, and then nothing. And I called back for 2 hours. That's the truth of the turning point of my life. I did the right thing, publicly, at cost, on purpose, and as far as I will ever be able to prove. It saved not one single person. There was no revelation waiting on the other side of it. There was no stranger who arrived in April and said, "I'm alive because of your broadcast." There was just a room full of hiss and my own voice coming back off the far bank. And it did not stay free. On the 22nd of January, it came back with a bill. 5 men and a John boat and a storm behind them. They'd triangulated us, or close enough. A whip antenna transmitting 9 nights running from a fixed point is a beacon, and the only tall thing on that stretch of river is my bridge, and I had told them my own name. They came at dusk in sleet, and they were organized, which frightened me more than anything with teeth ever has. 2 on the west bank with a truck and an extension ladder. 3 in the boat working the piers. They didn't shout demands. They just started trying doors, the way a man checks a car lot. We did nothing. That's the whole tactic. Gangway up in 11 seconds, ladder up, stove damped down to nothing, so no smoke, red lights off, 4 people lying flat on a plywood floor behind a wall of moving blankets, breathing into our sleeves so the fog wouldn't show at the clear pane. They got the extension ladder onto the northwest leg and reached the cut line at 18 feet. And then they were on a caged ladder 18 feet up in freezing rain, with 66 rungs above them, and no idea what was at the top. 2 of them came up. I could hear their boots ring the rungs through the steel, through the tower, through the deck plate, into my chest. Sleet on a lattice tower is the loudest thing in the world. They got as far as the northwest machinery house door, which is barred from inside, on a house with nothing in it. They spent 40 minutes with a pry bar on an empty building. Then the storm did the rest of my work. The wind came around northwest and got up over 50, and that boat had to leave the piers or die at them. And the men on the ladder came down, because a lattice tower and a crosswind at 50 is a thing that will kill a professional, let alone a man with a pry bar and an appetite. I'll tell you what I was actually doing during the worst of it, which was not heroics. I was up in my own machinery house with a hand on the chimney's guy wire feeling for the harmonic, because the storm was testing every single thing I had built. And the thing I was afraid of was not the men. It was my own stovepipe coming apart, or the gangway's snatch block chattering loose, or 400 square feet of steel roof taking my solar panels to Kentucky. The thimble held. The guys held. The gangway hung there in 50-mile wind and swung 9 inches and did not do one other thing. That's what all those boring days of grease and air gaps and 11-second drills were for. Not for a moment of courage, for a night when courage was irrelevant and only the hardware mattered. By morning, it was clear, and 11 degrees, and there was ice on every rivet head, like the bridge had been dipped in glass. The truck was gone off the west bank. The boat was gone. There was an extension ladder lying in the mud where they'd left it. And I went down at noon with a come-along, and I took it, because we needed a ladder. The bridge still stood. So did we. That was 14 months ago. Margot is still here. Teo is 19 now, and he's the one who runs the windlass rebuild, and he still sings, and I still let him. There are 11 of us on this bridge, and we vet every one of them the same way, from the catwalk with the ladder up. And I ask the same 4 questions, in the same order every time, and I will until I die. 6 words are still on the bulletin board in carpenter pencil. Heat, water, food, power, access, waste. Nobody's changed one of them. We've added 100 rules underneath, and they're all just those 6 words wearing different clothes. You may never stand on a lift bridge like this one, and I hope you never have to. But whatever building you're in right now, listening to this, you can start tonight. Pick a place you can actually hold, not the one you wish you had. Learn its doors. Learn which one swings out and which one a man could kick through. And fix the second one this week. Learn its blind spots where somebody could stand for an hour and not be seen from any window. Learn its noises, so that when a noise happens that isn't on the list, your body knows before your head does. Then make simple rules, few enough that a scared person can remember them at 3 in the morning. Write them where everybody can see them. Follow them when it's stupid and unnecessary, because that's the only way they'll be there when it isn't. And fix small problems before they're big ones. The cracked weld, the low sight glass, the door that only latches if you lift it. Nobody looks up, and nobody looks at the small thing, and nobody ever does until something falls on them. One more thing, and then I'm done. My brother Neil gave me 4 hours, and I spent them on my own 2 children, and I have never found out what happened to him. And I have stopped expecting to. June is 13 now, and she asked me last spring whether we should have told people. I gave her a careful answer about how there wasn't time and how the roads would have jammed and how it wouldn't have changed the outcome. And every word of that is defensible, and I've defended it. But here's what I didn't say to her, and what I'll say to you, because you're not my kid, and I'm never going to have to look at your face across a stove. If I could go back and stand in that pull-off again, with my brother's hand flat on the window glass and 4 hours in my pocket, I would do exactly what I did. I would sign my son out first because his school was closer. I would not knock on more than 1 door. I would take the peaches. I know what that makes me. I've had 14 months and a very quiet room to work it out in. She'll ask me again someday when she's older and she can hold the real answer, and I'll have to decide then whether to hand it to her. I already know I won't. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.